From the golden age of serials to today's blockbusters, Superman has soared across the screens for over 75 years, evolving with each new era while remaining a timeless symbol of hope. With the upcoming release of James Gunn's new Superman film, let's take a flight through the history of Superman on screen, where every adaptation, whether beloved or forgotten, left its mark on the legacy of the character.
Thank you.
Don't try now. You'll be seeing me again. Up, up, and away!
The first attempt at a live-action Superman was in 1948 with the 15-part serial simply titled Superman, starring Kirk Allen. Being the first live-action Superman, the budget was minimal, action was simplistic, and the plots were fairly grounded with very minimal sci-fi elements. The sets were basically non-existent, with many scenes taking place outdoors. Flight scenes were the most unique of all, though, achieved by swapping the actor with a cartoon version of Superman whenever he took off, then hiding his landing behind objects to mask the transition back to live action. Still, the serial was a hit, leading to a 1950s sequel, Atom Man vs. Superman. The follow-up wasn't really that different from the initial series, but there was a slight jump in the visual effects when it came to the flying.
You're not going to shoot those little creatures. In the first place, they haven't done you any harm. In the second place, they may be radioactive.
Then in 1951, Superman and the Mole Men introduced George Reeves as Superman. Superman and the Mole Men wasn't too different from the earlier serials, though because it was a film, the narrative was much more focused rather than a series of different adventures. The plot is what you expect out of a sci-fi story from the 50s, but surprisingly, Superman and the Mole Men had some pretty in-depth commentary on prejudice. Superman in the film defends the Mole Men from the fearful townsfolk and serves as a moral anchor. This version of Superman wasn't just a powerful hero, he was a symbol of tolerance, justice, and restraint in the face of ignorance. He was a very authoritative and confrontational figure in this film, not being afraid to berate the townspeople for their irrational actions.
Men like you that make it difficult for people to understand one another.
But he was also willing to use force against them if it came to it.
Whoever fired that shot came close to killing Miss Lane. Obviously, none of you can be trusted with guns, so I'm going to take them away from you.
Superman here is a man of action and change, which is needed to protect not only the townspeople from themselves, but also the people thereafter. A take that was more interesting than the serial's version of Superman, who besides being charismatic at times, didn't really have a personality worth latching onto. Technically, the film improved Superman's flight scenes by using wirework and new projection techniques, replacing the animated sequences with more believable flying effects. Superman and the Mole Men essentially served as a pilot for the upcoming television series, Adventures of Superman, which debuted in 1952 and would go on to define Superman for an entire generation.
You saved my life. That's more than you deserve.
Say, Jim, whoa!
Excuse me.
That's a bad outfit!
So, with the popularity of the earlier Superman adaptations, it was only a matter of time before the character got a major big-budget film, which officially began development in 1973. Though it was anything but smooth, the project cycled through multiple writers and directors before landing on Richard Donner, who brought focus and direction to the production. After a lengthy casting search, Christopher Reeve was the second actor to portray Superman on the big screen. As one of the most expensive films of its time, Superman the movie brought the character to life with an unprecedented level of quality. There was a significant usage of miniatures to create grand scenery such as Krypton, enhanced by the use of large-scale sets. The film also utilized new visual and practical effects to make Superman come to life with the use of wirework for Superman's takeoff and landing, blue screen with unique camera work to sell the effect of Superman flying towards and away from the screen, and new projection technologies and techniques to simulate the feeling of him soaring through the air much more believably than what was shown in Superman and the Moment. It's not perfect by today's standards, but for the time, these were groundbreaking effects nobody had seen before. Stylistically, Superman established its own identity, one that was so iconic that it even influenced the comics. Superman wasn't interested in being strictly a comic-accurate adaptation. Instead, it aimed to define how superheroes would work in cinema. The film's hopeful, sincere tone, bolstered by John Williams' now iconic theme, made Superman resonate with audiences beyond just comic book fans. Reeves' portrayal also captured everything core to the character: his moral clarity, his kindness, and his stern but compassionate demeanor resonated with many viewers. As he says in the film, Superman was not a figure of authority, but a friend. He had this polite way of speaking with an old-fashioned demeanor. However, he also possessed a very corny sense of humor as well.
Hi there. Nothing wrong with the elevator?
Unfortunately, the success of the film would not last, as during the production of Superman 2, Donner was infamously fired before the film was complete, and a new director reworked significant portions of the sequel. While Superman 2 was still relatively well received, the next two entries in the franchise were critically panned. The mishandling of the series would eventually lead Superman to be shelved from major live-action films for years to come.
No, sir. Don't thank me, Warden. We're all part of the same team.
You are pathetic. You may be dangerous, you may be powerful, but you're still a bad joke.
Just because Superman on film was shelved doesn't mean he couldn't have a presence on TV. The Adventures of Superboy came out a year after the last film. It was a TV series that centered on a younger Clark Kent during his college years before he officially became Superman. Like The Adventures of Superman, the show featured a mix of grounded and sci-fi storylines, but with more classic comic villains and a greater embrace of the Silver Age tone. Really, it's not that different from the Christopher Reeve movies. However, it is a lot more comic accurate. In fact, it's also much more wacky
Superboy did this
than even the movies. Though it never became a mainstream hit, Superboy developed a cult following and had plans for TV movie continuations. However, by the time of season 4, DC had already begun planning a brand new Superman show.
Now, I realize that you probably have everything under control, but since I'm here...
The new series Lois and Clark: The New Adventures of Superman followed a familiar, episodic format, with Superman facing both grounded and fantastical threats. But what made it stand out was the focus on the Daily Planet and Clark Kent's day-to-day life. More than just a superhero show, it leaned heavily into the office drama, journalism, and above all, the romantic tension between Clark and Lois Lane. The series played into the classic will they, won't they dynamic, tracking their evolving relationship across increasingly chaotic and emotional situations. Romance became the emotional core of the show, and viewers were especially drawn to the chemistry between the leads.
You weren't the slightest bit jealous of me and Tony Taylor.
You'd like that, wouldn't you?
One major difference, however, is that this version of Clark was portrayed differently, more confident, witty, and charming than past iterations, though it did blur the line between his Clark and Superman personas. Visually, the show didn't push effects much further than its predecessors, sticking with wirework and rear projections, though some of the stylized, retro-inspired sets helped it give it a unique look.
If you ever need to find me, all you have to do is look up.
In the year 2000, Miles Miller and Alfred Goh pitched Smallville, a series centered entirely on Clark's formative years in his hometown. Rather than depict Superman in costume, Smallville focused on Clark's upbringing, friendships, and challenges in Smallville. It followed the structure of a teen drama, blending the angst, romance, and self-discovery common to the late 90s and early 2000s teen dramas. In the case of Smallville, Superman's powers are not only used as an allegory for puberty and Clark's emotional development, but it also ties into his conflicts about his place in the world. Is he truly human, or is he just a passive observer of humanity, someone who knows their faults and aspirations but can never be a part of it? Smallville then is about Clark understanding and learning to accept himself in this world, developing the values and strengths that would eventually transform him into a hero. While the character drama was at the forefront, the show still included enough superhero action to satisfy fans. It marked a noticeable leap in TV production value, with better CGI, smoother flying effects, and a more cinematic look. Smallville also stood out for embracing the wider DC universe, featuring numerous heroes and iconic characters throughout its run. The show quickly became a massive success, breaking viewership records for the network and proving that Superman was still an incredibly popular and bankable IP. While Smallville was still airing, WB made attempts to bring Superman back to the big screen. The first serious attempt was in 2004 with a project titled Superman Flyby, written by J.J. Abrams. This version leaned into a more fantastical plot while also reimagining Superman's origin story. But despite early interest, Flyby fell into development hell. Production stalled, and the project would eventually be shelved that same year. While Flyby was in limbo, director Bryan Singer, fresh off the first X-Men film, began developing a very different Superman film. Instead of rebooting the franchise, Singer pitched a bold idea, a direct continuation of the Christopher Reeve films, one that would ignore the third and fourth entries and pick up the story after Superman 2. The film would explore Superman returning to Earth after a mysterious absence and how the world had changed in the meantime. Superman Returns didn't hold back in terms of ambition. It featured elaborate, retro-inspired set designs, major Hollywood stars, a new unknown lead as Superman, and ambitious stunts and visual effects. The suit itself was a modernized take on Reeves' classic costume. Being a mid-2000s production, the film made full use of emerging green screen tech and CGI, delivering what was at the time the most believable and visually immersive version of Superman and his powers ever seen on screen. From his flight to his strength, some of the film's imagery remains iconic to this day. Visually and stylistically, Superman Returns nailed the retro homage, but where it deviated dramatically was in tone. Instead of the bright optimism many associated with the character, the film leaned into a melancholic atmosphere. It was a story about isolation and the feeling of being left behind by a world that once idolized you, and a world that seemed so fantasy-like and hopeful not so long ago. This Superman was quieter, more distant, and emotionally burdened. A man trying to find his place in a world that has seemingly moved on. As a result, Superman, while still being polite, is a lot more subdued in his emotions. It was more of a psychological and emotional take on the character, far more introspective than action-driven. And while that direction was compelling to some, it didn't fully connect with general audiences at the time.
Will we see you? Around?
I'm always around. He hasn't quite factored in the idea of being the savior of the world until Zod turns up.
In 2008, David Goyer had an idea of a grounded and contemporary Superman story. Nolan, loving the idea, pitched the project to Warner Brothers, who immediately greenlighted the film. Goyer and Nolan would develop the idea for a few years, eventually bringing on Zack Snyder to direct the project. Zack Snyder's Superman is portrayed as a deeply messianic figure, but not just in the traditional sense of a savior. His story is grounded in free will and existential reflection. Snyder, along with Nolan and David Goyer, crafted a version of Superman that existed not in a heightened comic book-like world, but in a contemporary reality that mirrors our own. This Superman isn't traditional like the comics. He's a lonely, conflicted man searching for purpose in a world that doesn't know what to make of him. Man of Steel asks the question, what would happen if someone like Superman actually existed? He's written to be relatable and real, someone burdened by his powers, unsure if revealing himself is the right choice. As a result, he's quieter and more reserved, with an aura of mystery surrounding him. We see the self-sacrificial savior archetype emerge in the film. Snyder uses heavy religious imagery and narrative parallels to draw this out, positioning Superman as a Christ-like figure whose very existence challenges humanity's understanding of morality, power, and existence itself. It's a radical, divisive take that deviates from the traditional comic book portrayals of the character, but one that resonated with many people who had never connected with Superman before. For them, this version felt serious, modern, and mythic in a way that was finally compelling.
Guess I'll just have to trust you.
While Superman was making a bold return to film, his comeback on TV was slower and more uncertain. He first appeared in the Supergirl series, but his role there was minor and largely forgettable. That changed in 2019 when the CW began developing Superman and Lois, a standalone series set in its own universe. Structured as a family drama, the show follows Clark, Lois, and their two sons as they move back to Smallville and navigate the challenges of balancing heroics with parenthood. Despite being a CW show, Superman and Lois surprised fans with its high production value and cinematic feel. The series became one of CW's best-rated superhero shows, in parts thanks to its more traditional, hopeful portrayal of Superman and its great writing in general.
And one of the reasons why the movie works so well in an emotional way is that it's about a character who is very comfortable in his own skin and starts to doubt himself for the first time in his life and really becomes a little unsure about who he is, where he came from, and where he's going. And that's the central emotional stakes of the film.
When Man of Steel released, a sequel seemed obvious. However, over the years, several directors tried to make Man of Steel 2, but none of their attempts went anywhere. However, eventually James Gunn came in as the new CEO of DC Studios, and his first major order of business was to scrap Man of Steel 2 in favor of a reboot he'd been working on for years at that point. Gunn's Superman story would feature a younger Clark Kent, not as the first superhero in this universe, but as one of many already operating in a well-established DC world. That decision allowed for a unique spin. How does Superman stand out in a world that already knows aliens, gods, and costumed vigilantes? What does he offer that others don't? That existential core of trying to find your place and meaning when you're not the first or only is central to Gunn's take. It's not just about strength or powers, it's about ideals. Superman is someone who believes in kindness, integrity, and hope. And Gunn wanted to show how these values could still matter even in a world jaded by power and corporate interests. It's a Superman who's learning how to inspire, not just save, who's trying to become a symbol of heroism in a cynical world, a world that can't fathom that someone is good for the sake of it and is not asking for something in return. To get that tone right, Gunn drew influence from a wide variety of Superman stories: All-Star Superman, Birthright, Kingdom Come, Superman for All Seasons, and even the original Richard Donner films. As a result, this new Superman comes off far more traditional when compared to the DCEU version. He's warm, idealistic, and compassionate, and even a little humorous, while still willing to act decisively when needed. It's a return to the hopeful Superman many fans have been waiting to see. Visually, that lighter tone is reflected in the film's aesthetic. There's brighter, more colorful cinematography, along with fantastical sets. Superman's costume even brings back the iconic red trunks. As far as effects go, the film doesn't have a massive leap beyond Man of Steel, but Gunn does bring a unique visual flair, especially during the flying scenes. These scenes are filmed with a dynamic drone-like camera movement that often fails to keep up with Superman's speed. Gunn Superman has not been released, but based on everything we know, there's a lot of reason to be optimistic.
Hey buddy, eyes up here.